Hey there, Smite fans, and welcome in to the SPL waiting room. I'm Agro. I'll be your host as per usual. And if you're just joining us for our second episode of this new series, this is where we go over what we saw in the previous weeks, give you some predictions, maybe talk about some changes. Like, for example, this week we're going to be talking about how the bonus balance will affect the SPL. But not just that. We've got a lot to discuss from what we saw in week one. And, of course, make fun of Mifflin for his week one predictions and hopefully continue the 100% streak on my own for week number 2. But overall, I want to take a step back before we get started, before I bring in the guest analysts, and talk about something that I really noticed during week 1 of the SPL, and that's this transformation for EUNITED. I'm sure most of you out there are probably thinking that I'm talking about their roster change, but I actually think the more important transformation for EUNITED in week 1 was their right side of the map. Both Scream and Variety looked like they returned to form in a lot of different games in their first week. And even though they were up against Radiance and Ghost, the two teams that were in the finals in the Phase 1 playoffs, EUNITED looked a lot better. And that's not to say that the new duo lane didn't have their struggles. Both Snoopy and GuyJ had games that were very ineffective at times. But they also had some games where they looked pretty effective. The real difference maker was how well Scream and Variety played. So if you're an EUNITED fan out there, I think that's the big key for this team. Of course, Snoopy getting used to support is one thing. But overall, if Scream can play like he did and Variety can play like what we know he's capable of, I think EUNITED could be a real dark horse team to make it into the top 6 and potentially cause some noise going into the World. So certainly a team to keep your eyes on. I mentioned Snoopy and how much he played support last week, and the big pick that he had, at least early in the week, was Cthulhu in support. But later on, we saw a lot more Cthulhu in the solo lane. We're going to talk about how strong Cthulhu was and how he's good pretty much everywhere. But as I told you guys last week, we want to get you, the community, involved. So what we're going to do right now is put up a poll in the chat. We want to hear your vote. Do you think Cthulhu at a pro level is better in support or in the solo lane? We'll be bringing in our analysts to see what they think about that exact same subject right after we have Finch and DOLSON recap week 1 for us.
So, Phase 2, Week 1 in the SPL is finally back. And folks, we had an absolute barn burner to start out the weekend, is what I would have said if the set were particularly close at all. Luckily for Dave writing this, though, both games were somewhat the same. 20-8 in kills for Game 1 and 19-7 in Game 2. Ghost had magical ADCs in both games, and Obey did not. And finally, Ghost had a good grasp of the meta in both games, and frankly, Obey didn't.
But with Finch, we did close out Friday with EUNITED versus Radiance, in our first look at EUNITED's roster changes. GuyJ is their new hunter, with Snoopy moving over to support. Surprisingly, Radiance allowed EUNITED to play Cthulhu in both games, and that gamble would pay off. Cyclone Spin showed off the potency of mage ADCs by soloing the Fire Giant in Game 1, my god, to give Radiance the edge they'd need to close out a very close match. Radiance made the most of their Phase 2 debut, and if Cyclone Spin and Adapting continue playing like they did against EUNITED, it's going to be a long phase for the rest of the league.
We kicked off Saturday with a battle that at least started somewhat close between the Knights and Space Station, but if there's anything we've learned, just one early kill on Ifreya will not stop the scaling. The Knights actually looked great in this one, but Space Station would not be denied once items came online. Devote had a great game on Jingwei, and Cherio had a strong early game on Robin, and the phase starts off hand emoji for SSG2. Oh, I don't know if I nailed that. Maybe it's too much linear energy for me there, Dave.
Yeah. Chef Kiss emoji is I think what I wrote on there. I don't know. I even messed it up and I wrote the damn thing. We said it time and again, though, Sanguine aren't trying to trick you. They just play the meta better. And that's exactly what we saw on our second set of the day on Saturday when they played the Renegades. In Game 2, Yarkor showed he can't be allowed to play Cthulhu twice in a row, dominating the laning phase and dismissing all who challenged him. It was a statement set for the number 1 seed from Phase 1, and Sanguine looked poised for another strong phase.
Yeah, let's talk about our first SPL Sunday of Phase 2, which brought EUNITED a shot at their first win of the phase and Ghost a chance to start off 2-0. A true classic awaited us in game number 3. Classic in the sense that Ghost got every pick it wanted, their play was nearly flawless, and almost the entire team had a great game to the point that only Scream was positive in the kill-to-death conversation.
On paper, seemed to be maybe the closest matchup of the week. Even more exciting, we get to see Lasbra's top-tier assassin gameplay up against Sano's tanky warrior playstyle. Apparently, Lasbra had heard all of that and didn't like being compared to the bottom-place team. He went on a rampage. 10-1-8 /line in Game 1, and that's on set. And then an equally impressive 8-0-6 performance on Nemesis in Game number 2. But that's it. That's Week 1 of Phase 2 of Season 7 of the SPL, as written by Finch and Dave, and then as told by Dave and Finch. It was an absolute blast to recap it. Here's to watching Week number 2.
Thank you very much to Dave and Finch for putting that together. As always, you can see more of that video and a little bit more elongated version on YouTube and our social. But we don't have to wait too long to hear from DOLSON because he's joining us live right here on the SPL Rating Room alongside GORE. Guys, welcome in. Thanks for joining us. And I want to start with what we just talked about with chat. Cthulhu support versus the solo lane. And GORE, I know you're the resident support guy that we've got on the show, so I want to start with you. What do you think makes Cthulhu a good support, and what do you think he struggles at in that role?
So the thing I think is best about him once you put him over there is the fact that he's impactful in every fight, right? That's one of the things supports have going on pretty much from the get-go, whether it's in duo lane or transitioning into mid. All of this, every engagement on the left-hand side of the map, the support's going to be a big hand in. Cthulhu getting part of that pretty early on. The ult's impactful. We've seen how great it can be in the middle of a fight. But I also think there's something to be said about the dash and how you can displace people, and that's kind of what we were seeing a lot of these, top-tier players do, where it's just, if I cut you off at just the right angle, pushes you like 1 or 2 steps closer to my ADC, and maybe they can kill you off a little bit faster. The downside is that you don't necessarily get maybe all those items online as fast. You don't, get to feel it, but you're so impactful from the get-go. You get to be a part of the fight and in the action every step of the way.
Yeah, it's really about numbers. The amount of engagements that you have Cthulhu ult in probably goes up in support. But Dave, is that ult strong enough to make it worth it in that slot, or do you think that he might be better in the solo lane where those ults may be less frequent but more impactful?
Yeah, I think luckily here I'm going to get bailed out by stats because I think his solo lane win rate is much higher than what we saw out of the support role. I think to your credit, it is a very impactful ultimate, but I think largely the solo lane is where he's going to flourish. I think reaching that level 20 earlier, getting maybe less supporty, more bruisery type items online a little bit earlier is where he's going to flourish. And you look at what FINCH was able to do specifically here in this set, especially to Snoopy, who tried to play this Cthulhu in the support role. Whether or not that's entirely because he got to this level 20 mark earlier, I mean, this is 26 minutes into the game, so the support's, a couple levels behind there. I just think you put Cthulhu in the solo lane, it's making a hard-to-kill thing harder to kill, and that's, never a bad thing to have on your side. Yarkor knocked it out of the park as well for Sanguine. I think Cthulhu belongs in the solo lane, getting him online early and often, and then getting into that team fight phase, especially for a team like Sanguine, certainly a good thing.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway is that Cthulhu's strong, and he's probably worth playing anywhere.
But
I agree, Dave. The stats certainly back up that he's a little bit better in solo lane. It seems that chat agrees with you. An overwhelming majority of the chat feel like it's better in solo than in support. 94%, in fact, over the support. Now, I don't think it's that obvious to me, but I do think that it is slightly better in the solo lane, at least at a pro level, because these duo lanes are a little bit more accustomed to dealing with that insane pressure that Cthulhu can bring in that 2v2. Going back to week 1, though, we just kind of recapped some Cthulhu. I want to talk about the mid lane because things got a little bit weird. We knew that Ring of HECATE was going to mean that magical ADCs were very popular in the long lane, but it also meant that we might see some different styles in the mid, including some hunter play. Dave, I know you were looking at some stats there for that.
Yeah, I had to put together some stats for this one, kind of dug into it. So traditional mages still picked around 73% of the time in the mid lane. So 13 total games played in week 1, 26 total mid lane picks if you want to look at it that way, one for each side. 73% of those were traditional mages. Now, hunters, not magical ADCs, we only saw one in the mid lane, that was Olaran, Ghost picked him up. But hunters were picked 6 out of 26 times, about 23%. So a quarter of the time you're watching in week 1, you're going to see a hunter in the mid lane. I think what was interesting is that it was largely dictated by what teams wanted to do in the long lane, where only once we saw a non-mage or magical ADC in the mid lane, so just hunters in general in the mid lane. Only once was there not a mage ADC over in the long lane. That was Obey, who tried to pair a Chernobog with an Ullr in mid and in the long lane, and didn't quite work out for them there. Radiant's had a 100% win rate on hunters out of the mid lane in week number 1, and largely I think the big takeaway has to be a lot of those hunters were more ability-based. You saw your Cupids a little bit on her, Neath. You build a little extra power on those abilities, and that kind of fills that mage void, I suppose, while offering some physical power. So I think my big takeaway, aggro, from week 1 is that the mid lane, still heavily mage-focused, but 25% of the time was kind of dictated by what these teams wanted to do over in the long lane.
Yeah, I feel like that really looking at your overall draft is the big key for what you want to do in the mid lane right now. Gore, was there any other trends that you saw that you would like to see continued here in week number 2 and beyond?
Well, the thing that was really interesting to me was the fact that we got some more bizarre picks, and I think there was a certain point where I even said, I don't care what you're playing mid as Vin, because the 4 guys around you were looking so good. And it almost feels like that's become the state of mid lane. I think a lot of these burst mages still feel really solid there, because you're still getting a lot of fights in, you're still getting a lot of farm in, you're not necessarily going to have anything that plays against you. But I think because of that, and specifically because the rise of, the Souls, your Freyas, to an extent your Olaruns, and sometimes the Chronos, you can play almost anything that you want over here, as long as it's going to have some form of burst damage. Sometimes, we can debate whether or not we like seeing those things, like the Yanis, but I think they're going to be able to pick up whatever they want. A lot of these snipes, anything that can confirm an objective is going to be solid, and I think we're going to end up seeing a lot more, as Dave's stats had pointed out, of these kind of big, bursty control mages that are coming through, just to help set up the rest of the team.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, the Giannis pick has been a heroine special, but Venenu pulling it out, Ven also piloting that Thoth, a pick to watch out for potentially in that mid lane, especially if we start to see less magical hunters because of bonus balance. And that's where I want to direct this next part of our discussion. We'll start with Ring of HECATE. Getting a nerf, went up 100 gold from 2,500 to 2,600, and it had that increased healing per stack. Literally gone. A whole part of the passive has been removed. It's become 100 gold more expensive. And fellas, I think we are still going to see magical ADCs prioritized and played in HECATE bot. It was that good initially. Gore, how do you feel?
I don't think much is going to change realistically from week 1 to week 2 here. I think this is going to help it, again, in the right direction of balance, but not into the point where it's, okay, completely gone or only being picked up, let's say, if you're shooting for it maybe 50% of the time, right? So I think this is an item that's going to come through. It still works incredibly well with your Typhon's Fang. So even though an issue with Typhon's Fang was going to be able to take 10 power off of that, even though there's reduced healing from this Ring of HECATE, this item is still going to be bonkers good, and I think Freya's still going to be one of the top bans. Same thing with Olarun, and if Barracuda showed us anything from week 1, the Soul as well.
Soul, definitely one of those popular picks. I do think that the biggest change this makes for HECATE is not going to be to gods like Olarun or Freya, but for those fringe playable gods like Alquang, who didn't see play in week 1 but got banned a little bit. Maybe the HECATE nerf keeps him out of pro play for now. And part of that, Dave, could be because of Golden Blade and how strong it's been. But Golden Blade also receiving a nerf in the bonus balance to decrease the attack speed from 20% to 15% and decrease the minion AoE damage from 75% to 50% on that passive. How do you think this changes the jungle?
Obviously you're going to be missing that 5% attack speed. I think in the grand scheme of things, not massive necessarily, but actually here, this is a great clip to have up. The 75% to 50% on the minion AoE is big. I mean, on paper, that's a 25% decrease. I don't think it changes really all that much. I think the clear is going to be maybe a couple of autos slower. But actually, we were talking about this earlier, Aggro, and I'm totally going to steal your talking point on it because I agree with you. If you're trying to build Golden Blade in the solo lane, I think that's where it really changes. Your wave clear isn't going to be quite as effective there, and I think that mitigates the solo lane presence of the Golden Blade. But to your specific question, how does this change the jungle? A couple auto attacks slower, I think, on clearing a few of those camps. I don't imagine it changes the face of the jungle meta, though, as we've seen it.
Completely agree with you. I do think it impacts the casuals a little bit more than the pros in this case. So
Sure.
those solo lane Golden Blade users might have to put it to bed for at least a little bit, though I'm sure they won't. Those people are freaks. They love to just slam Golden Blade solo lane.
They do.
Definitely did not get beat by one of those this week. I don't know why anyone would ask me that. Anyways, Spear of the Magus is the last item up on the chopping block, at least for bonus balance, that we feel like is going to really affect the pro lane meta. Increase the cost from $2,450 to $2,600, so now Spear of Desolation price, and decrease the duration of the passive from 10 seconds to 7 seconds, while simultaneously moving the cooldown of that passive from 10 to 15. So before, it was a 10-second internal cooldown, but the debuff lasted 10 seconds on the enemy, so it was always up. Now your debuff is a little bit shorter, and you add 5 seconds onto that internal cooldown. So now there is basically half the time in the fight where Magus is not very effective. Goremizer, do you think that this removes Magus from the conversation?
I don't think it removes it. I think a lot of the changes that we've talked about today realistically are just slowing the pace down. I think not having it up as often is maybe going to make you rethink your engagement, but I don't think it's going to make you stop buying the item altogether. There's definitely more room for flexibility in that mid-roll. Maybe you're not going for it instantly like we've seen some people do, and you're buying it outright at the very beginning. Maybe it's going to be delayed a little bit, but I do think that little bit of a price gap is just going to maybe push it down in the build as opposed to get rid of it completely.
I love the fact that our highlights are Doug. NA Caravan slamming people on the battleground of the gods. So you best know, I don't know when he starts filming this footage, but if we're talking about some item changes and they're magical, you better be watching out for NA Caravan's Raw slamming the queues, because that is fearsome there for sure.
Terrified.
Dave, I do think that this might make a pretty big change in the mage build right now. I know that you play a good amount of mid lane. I don't know about you, but I've been experimenting a lot with Book of Thoth builds, and with that cheaper Book of Thoth, I've been liking those quite a bit. Do you think that we'll see teams prioritize either different builds or maybe some different gods with this Magus change?
Yeah, I wonder if it's maybe more different gods. Build-wise, absolutely, and I think Book of Thoth is certainly a good one to bring up. But I look at different gods maybe in this conversation, where the kind of big thing with Spear of the Magus was trying to apply that debuff on a specific enemy, and now that it lasts a little bit shorter, I guess is the word I'm looking for there, and the cooldown to get it again is a little bit longer, I almost wonder if we're going to start seeing gods that are much more pinpoint accurate on applying that debuff. I want it on this person, I need it on them, because I can't reapply it again for another 5 seconds longer. So, you look at Scylla's, their crush is obviously a decent-sized circle, but mages with maybe more difficult to hit, but accurate skill shots, I wonder if they start to come to the forefront of the meta. The Giannis's we've seen a decent bit, a big portal can be kind of accurate as far as applying that debuff to somebody. So I think I could see it start to shift in that direction.
I think it's an interesting point for sure. Well, we've got a pretty big week ahead of us as well. Can't just look into the past, including our big talking point of the week is going to be Sanguine and their big test. Luckily, we got a chance to sit down with the team recently to see how they've been feeling so far in Season 7. Here's a sneak peek.
Favorite person to lane against in the SPL, and then least favorite person to lane against. And it can be for any reason. It doesn't have to be necessarily the hardest one, or maybe someone who, like they have a really annoying playstyle or something like that. Wrong you, I see you maybe got someone coming to mind. Do you have a least favorite and a favorite person to lane against?
Yeah, I'd like to face PBM and PandaCat because I think they're probably the best, if not the best. Because, I don't know, they play so well, they don't make mistakes. I think it's like a good laning phase against them because you can learn a lot of things from them. And I hate back in the day, I mean probably right now still, to play against Awesome Jake, only to Awesome Jake. Like he was playing there with Blink and he was dying in screens, so I was like, what are you doing? And then he pulled off the Osiris support with us and he beat us, and then he put it in the SPL and I was like, you think it's gonna work? And he lost. I was like, and he lost. I was like, okay, I don't know, I just hate his playstyle, but nothing personal.
Hearing more from the Sanguine guys, always a treat. Finch's whole conversation with the team can be found right now on the SMITEPro YouTube that just got released, hot off the presses. as they say. So make sure you guys go and check that out, because Sanguine has a very big week ahead of them, including our first matchup here today on Friday. But we got to look at the whole thing first before we get into that. Sanguine versus Space Station is our first match, as I said. Then Radiance PK. So y'all turned into picked a pretty good day to tune in. Going to be some great games today. And then Sanguine's tough week continues on Sunday up against Radiance. So, guys, I want to talk about how this team is going to navigate this schedule, because last week it was really EUNITED with the very difficult doubleheader. Now it's Sanguine's, and Sanguine's expectations for themselves and the community's expectations for this team are pretty high. I know we'll get into our specific predictions in just a little bit, but Dave, I want to start with you. How do you think that Sanguine has done so far here with the meta changes? Were you impressed with what they pulled out last week?
I wasn't, and you asked me impressed. I think impressed, yes. Surprised, not at all. And this is absolutely not a slight against Sanguine, but you look at what these guys play, it is what is good in the meta. They just do it better than the people they play against. So I was impressed with their ability to adapt to the meta, pick up something new, and be this good at it this early on. And you know, you look at some of their opponents, or the opponent, they beat the Renegades 2-0. The Renegades looked very good in that set, so I was very surprised to see that Sanguine was able to, you know, adapt so quickly to what is suddenly good and make it look so good. But kind of our whole talking point here is, how does that look against the next couple of top teams they have to go up against? Well, we'll get into predictions, as you mentioned, a little bit later. But I was very surprised and impressed, really, with Sanguine and the speed with which they picked up, you know, the jungler picks, the magical ADCs, shifted around their play style and made it look good.
Yeah, they really that's kind of what they do. They've been doing it basically all year. And Gore, as Dave said, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody at this point. But which match do you think will give them more trouble this week, Space Station or Radiance?
I'm honestly leaning a little bit more towards Space Station being just a tough one, and that's just because of who Space Station is. I think that it's one of those teams that it almost seem always on the cusp of ready to change the meta to whatever they want to be. I mean, you go back, you look at it, Rafford starts bringing out the Geb and Khepri, I think, a little bit before everybody else. I think it was him and kind of Wrong You that really helped herald those forward, but I think they also have a pretty solid grasp on what they like to play, and they also have a really good 5v5 team fight, which is where Sanguine has their best moments of the game. Between, you know, this week specifically, I think SSG is going to give them the most late game trouble, although if we can get the Radiance that we got to see during our summer finals, essentially, for Phase 1, then it completely changes my mind about that. But it really is just, if we're seeing a regular season Radiance versus that special time Radiance, that is going to make the big difference.
I think that's a great point. Both of these teams are very good in the late game. Chat, if you're watching right now, you got to get your votes in. How will Sanguine finish the week? 2-0, 1-1, or 0-2? And I'm going to ask both of you guys the exact same question. If you had to put your votes in on those three options, Dave, what are you taking?
I say 1-1. I think they split the week. I think you're playing with too much fire. Completely to Gore's point, I think all you need is SSG to show up and have an incredible day, or Radiance to show up and have an incredible day. Obviously, it's kind of a no-brainer phrase, but I think both of the teams have the potential to do it. I think Sanguine split the week.
Gore, I'm about to ask you the same thing, but then I realized we've got the whole predictions graphic ready to go, so you can talk about your choice as we look at our overall predictions for the week. Looks like you have them going 2-0 this week, Gore.
Yes, and honestly, it really is coming down to the fact that I do think that both teams are going to give them trouble, but I'm going with the same philosophy I use in one way about Obey, but also that I adopted in Phase 1, which is until someone proves to me they can regularly beat Sanguine, they have to be my vote. They have just been so solid and so consistent throughout Phase 1 and what we've seen. And, you know, we talk about it all the time. These guys are always playing Smite. They never seem to stop. So you always get that idea that they are going to be, like, you know, Dave said, right ahead of the curve, playing the things that are going to be the freshest. I mean, Netrioid was pulling out Freya in Phase 1 when nobody was playing Freya. So now that she's meta, I think it just plays into their hand.
Well, this is our look at what we saw last week from the community and from us as a casting team. Dave, feeling pretty good up here at 100%, if I do say so myself.
That's right.
Feeling pretty good looking down upon everybody else, though. We'll have to see if that'll continue this week. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. By the way, real quick, chat, 61% of you think Sanguine's going 1-1. We'll find out right at the beginning of the day here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you for the entire SPL today.